A passenger lashed out at a father for singing to his baby. Then the sound of a click behind him made the entire plane go silent. A passenger punched the father for singing to his baby, thinking no one would stop him. He didn't realize a click sounded behind his head, signaling that the father was ready to act with precision. The moment his fist connected, the cabin's tension exploded. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses instantly when true power stands up. The first sound was not the lullaby, but the crackle of tension beneath it. Volaris Flight 319 had just leveled off, the cabin dipping into the calm rhythm of cruise altitude. Overhead, bins were latched, tray tables folded, and a soft, amber light settled over the cabin like dusk in a sky no one could escape. And beneath that glow, a melody drifted, not through the speakers, not through official channels, but from the lips of a man holding a child. Darren Malvik sat in seat 14C, a quiet figure with thoughtful eyes and a calm that felt almost misplaced on an evening flight full of sighs and recycled air. He cradled his infant son, Leiron, close to his chest, one hand stroking the soft curve of the baby's back. The lullaby he sang was low and private, a tune meant not for the world, but for one small life in his arms. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly distinct. Just a soft, rhythmic hum, part melody, part memory. Across the aisle, something cracked. It wasn't metal or turbulence. It was a man's resolve. Torin Hald, seated in 14D, shifted in his seat as if trying to free himself from something invisible. He was built like a wall, square shoulders, thick arms, and a jaw set so tight you could count the veins in his neck. His stare fixed on Darren with an intensity that didn't match the moment. To an observer, it might have looked like annoyance. But annoyance didn't make your hands curl into fists on your lap. It didn't make your pupils dilate. It didn't make you whisper things to yourself that no one else could hear. Flight attendant Rennick Vos, making his way down the aisle with the strained grace of someone 2 hours past his limit, glanced at the scene. A lullaby, a father, a fussy baby now soothed into calm, nothing out of place. Torin looked tense, sure, but Rennick chalked it up to travel fatigue. He offered a polite nod, passed their row, and continued. But behind him, Torin didn't blink. His lips twitched. He shouldn't be singing that, Torin muttered. No one heard. Not yet. Darren, meanwhile, focused only on Leiron. This was their first flight alone since his wife's passing. Every note he sang carried more than melody. It carried her. Her voice, her memory, the nights they'd sat by the crib together, humming this very tune. Darren didn't sing to impress. He sang to preserve something. And Leiron, tiny hand gripping his shirt, seemed to know. Karen Vale, seated a row back and diagonally across, noticed Torin's shifting posture. He wasn't close enough to hear the muttering, but body language spoke louder. Karen, a systems analyst with a side obsession for observing human behavior, tucked away his e-reader and narrowed his gaze. Torin was rigid, not just uncomfortable, controlled, as if trying not to move too quickly for fear of what might follow. Darren felt something too, not fear, but awareness. That sixth sense parents develop when their child's safety might be compromised. He softened his tone, nearly whispering now, hoping to settle Leiron into sleep. But Leiron's eyes stayed open, wide and calm, reflecting cabin lights like stars. Torin's breathing changed. Not louder, just tighter, controlled exhalations like someone preparing for a confrontation. He turned slightly in his seat, resting one elbow on the armrest, jaw twitching. He stared at Darren like the man was a trigger, not a fellow passenger. His fists opened, then closed again. Foreshadowing flickered in every breath. Rennick passed again, slower this time. He caught Torin's expression, jaw clenched, eyes distant, but hesitated to interfere. A crying baby usually sparked more complaints than a quiet one. He gave Darren a small nod of appreciation and moved on. Darren closed his eyes for a moment, humming the bridge of the melody, the part his wife had written. the part Laron responded to most. That's when Torin tensed again and whispered a line not meant for anyone but himself. "Not again. Not tonight. Make it stop." The words passed through Torin's lips in a whisper only he could hear, yet they landed like thunder inside his chest. His fingers twitched at the edge of the armrest where plastic creaked faintly beneath the pressure of his tightening grip. The lullaby, soft, slow, haunting, melted into the low hum of the engines, but to him it might as well have been a siren dragging him toward madness. Across the aisle, Darren gently adjusted the baby in his arms. Laron stirred slightly, tiny hands curling and uncurling against his father's chest. Darren's voice lowered instinctively, the familiar melody falling back to barely a breath, yet still audible enough to calm the child. He didn't look up, didn't notice the storm tightening in the seat across from him. His focus, unwavering, was on the small life curled against his heart. This was their first flight alone, and he had promised himself it would be peaceful. But the past had other plans. Torin's chest rose unevenly. The song. It wasn't just a sound. It was a trigger, a reminder, a ghost. His mind spiraled backward to a night etched in flames, a screaming child, and a man standing too far away. He blinked hard, trying to shake the images, but they gripped him like vines. The same melody, the same softness, the same helpless cry. Rennick Vos passed quietly through the aisle, scanning seat numbers and nodding courteously to the passengers. When he reached Torin's row, he noticed the clenched jaw, the white-knuckled fists, and the glassy look in his eyes. He hesitated. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, voice low and respectful. Torin didn't respond. He didn't even blink. Rennick waited another second, then nodded to himself and moved on, assuming the man was simply anxious about flying. His morning shift had been long, turbulent, and riddled with delays. He'd seen far worse. But Karen Vale hadn't. Seated just behind Darren, Karen observed quietly, a small black notebook resting on his lap. He'd been jotting idle thoughts and impressions throughout the flight, a habit from years of behavioral study. The man across the aisle had caught his eye long before the lullaby began. Now he watched closely as Torin's shoulders rose with uneven breath. The tension wasn't normal. It wasn't even irritated. It was charged. Without a word, Torin stood up. The motion was quick, too sudden for someone merely stretching. He reached for the overhead bin with jerky precision, pretending to rummage for something. But he wasn't searching. He was stalling, gathering nerve, trying to smother the urge that had been building since takeoff. The melody behind him floated on, winding its way under his skin. The baby had started to coo softly again, reassured by the song. Torin's jaw locked. Darren looked up briefly, just enough to register movement. Their eyes didn't meet. He looked back down, brushed Laron's head with his thumb, and kept singing. A deep crack formed in Torin's restraint. He returned to his seat slowly, though everything inside him screamed to move faster, to lash out. His legs felt heavy, his palms damp. He sat with a thud, arms stiff, back ramrod straight. His face flushed red, but not from embarrassment. He was boiling inside. "You think you're safe," he whispered to no one. "You think that song makes you better." It wasn't Darren's voice he was hearing. It wasn't Darren's face he was seeing. In Torin's fractured mind, the past had bled into the present, painting over the man with the features of another, someone who'd failed, someone who had walked away. The lullaby danced again through the air. Darren leaned back, eyes tired but serene. The melody slipped from his lips like breath itself. Karen noticed Torin flinch, not once but twice, and leaned slightly into the aisle, alert. He tucked his notebook away and placed both feet flat on the floor. Something was coming. Plastic groaned under Torin's fingers. Rennick glanced back again from his post, saw the same tension, the same unreadable expression, but once more he dismissed it. People get uneasy. People get claustrophobic. It's just a song, he thought. Harmless. But it wasn't harmless to Torin. He wasn't just remembering. He was reliving. When Darren hit the final note of the lullaby, something inside Torin shattered like glass. The music folded over the last nerve he had, and his eyes narrowed into a kind of terrifying stillness. His body didn't jerk, didn't twitch, but his breathing shifted into sharp, panicked rhythm. "Make it stop." The words returned, barely a sound. Then he muttered again, a new sentence, thick with venom and grief. He never turned around. Karen leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me?" he asked gently. But Torin didn't hear. His focus locked onto Darren. His hands twitched. His knees tensed. Darren rocked Laren gently, missing the shift by inches. In Torin's eyes, the soft singing had turned into a taunt, the peaceful tone into a lie. He didn't see a father trying to soothe his child. He saw a man pretending nothing had ever gone wrong. He gritted his teeth and said it again, louder this time. "Make it stop." His fingers rose slowly from the armrest. Not fists. Not yet. But something more dangerous. The unshackling of control. Karen's pulse ticked faster. He looked around for Rennick. The flight attendant was several rows away now, chatting with a passenger about snack service. Karen looked back at Torin and saw something final in his face. This was no longer discomfort. It was a fuse burning toward the end. "Sir," Karen said carefully, "maybe you should." But he didn't finish the sentence. Because just then, Torin's eyes locked forward, every breath tightening, his lips trembling with something unsaid for far too long. The cabin around him blurred. The sound of the engine faded. Only the lullaby remained. And as fate wove its last thread into place, something inside Torin snapped into motion. Darren barely had time to blink. As he shifted Laron gently to his shoulder, humming the first few notes of the lullaby again, just a soft, calming rhythm to help his son settle after the turbulence, a shadow moved across the aisle. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't a stumble. It was deliberate. Torin hauled, stood. Before anyone could ask what he was doing, he took one step forward, then another, and without warning, he threw a full-force punch directly into Darren's jaw. A sickening thud cracked through the hush of the cabin. Darren's head snapped sideways, slamming into the armrest. His body twisted, but instinct took over, his arms wrapped tightly around Laron, shielding him from the impact. The baby let out a sharp cry, frightened by the sudden jolt. Gasps erupted. A woman screamed. Someone's tray clattered to the floor. Across the aisle, Rennick Voss spun around, his cart jolting as he nearly lost control. He froze for a heartbeat, his eyes wide, uncomprehending. In the same breath, Karen Vale sprang up from his seat, knocking his knee against the seat in front of him. His hands were up, but for a moment he stood still, stunned, unsure if what he'd just seen had actually happened. The cabin burst into chaos. A man in row 7 slammed his finger into the overhead call button, jamming it again and again. Another passenger across the aisle pulled out his phone, the red recording light blinking within seconds. Shouts rose on all sides, a wave of noise building fast. Torin stood over Darren, his chest heaving. His fists trembled, and his face, far from triumphant, looked stricken, pale with a strange mix of rage and disbelief. It was as if he couldn't quite believe he'd actually done it, but that didn't stop him from taking another step forward. Darren, cradling Laron, groaned and forced himself upright. His jaw throbbed. The metallic taste of blood began to rise in his mouth. He pushed it aside. His focus was clear now, razor sharp. Protect his son. Nothing else mattered. Laron cried, his voice high and panicked. Torin flinched at the sound as if it stabbed him directly. Something flickered across his face. Fear? Memory? Darren didn't know, but it gave him a split-second window. He repositioned Laron, using his left arm to shield the boy's head and torso, his right bracing against the armrest to steady himself. "Stop," Karen said, his voice low but firm as he stepped into the aisle. "Back off, man. Right now." Torin didn't respond. His eyes locked on Darren, but they weren't seeing him. They were seeing someone else, someone from a different time, someone who haunted him. Back. Away, Karen repeated, stepping fully between them now. Darren didn't say a word, but inside a different part of him was waking up. Most people knew Darren Malvik as a quiet, thoughtful engineer. What they didn't know, and what no one in that cabin could have guessed, was that he had spent 6 years in the Velen Response Corps. He had trained in high-stress conflict resolution, hostage de-escalation, and counter-threat analysis. He hadn't used those skills in years. He prayed he never would again. But tonight, in the middle of the sky, they came rushing back. Rennick finally snapped out of his shock. His hands trembled as he reached for the intercom attached to the wall. "Cockpit, we have a situation," he whispered into the receiver. "Assault in cabin. Repeat, passenger assaulted mid-flight. We need containment protocol." Inside the cockpit, the captain responded sharply, ordering the crew to secure the front and assess the threat. But time was running out. Torin moved again. He lunged toward Darren, ignoring Karen's warning. Karen stepped forward, arms out, trying to hold him back. Torin shoved him aside with frightening ease. Karen stumbled into a seat, dazed but still conscious. Darren didn't panic. He stayed low, keeping his body between Torin and Leiron. Slowly, he reached down toward the underside of his seat. His fingers found the small black clasp of his travel-issued personal safety device, a discreet alarm beacon provided by his company for high-risk travel. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't loud, but it had silent tech embedded that connected him to ground-level assistance. He tapped it once. A red light blinked, unnoticed by everyone. Torin didn't see it. He was focused on Darren's eyes. His own expression was unstable, mouth twitching, eyes darting. His hands curled and uncurled. His breathing came in shallow bursts. The noise in the cabin dimmed somehow. Passengers fell into a stunned, fearful hush. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. The only sound was Laurent's frightened sobs and the soft creak of Torin's boots as he stepped closer. Darren stood now between the bulkhead and his attacker. His legs were steady. He said nothing, but the way he held himself, centered, grounded, was different. Subtle tension flowed through his muscles like coiled steel, restrained but ready. Then, something broke the rhythm. A small sound, a faint metallic clink, rang out from the floor near Torin's boot. Karen, still slouched against the seat beside them, saw it first. His eyes widened. A thin, folded object had slipped from Torin's jacket pocket. It bounced once on the floor and came to rest between the seats. A knife. Compact, black-handled, the kind designed to look like a harmless tool until it's in the wrong hands. Torin didn't see it, but Darren did. Karen did. The stakes had changed. Darren's eyes narrowed. He didn't move. His voice, when it came, was quiet, measured. "Don't take another step." Torin froze. The warning wasn't loud, but something in the way Darren said it made even the air pause. And then came the moment, the one that rewrote everything, even before anyone had time to process it fully. Because now, it wasn't just about trauma or confusion or grief. It wasn't just about a punch or a mistake or a man misremembering a face. There was a knife on the floor, a weapon no one expected, and that was the moment the danger changed shape entirely. Torin lunged. A burst of air cut through the aisle as his body surged forward, but the sound that followed wasn't the scuffle of impact. It was a click, a cold, sharp, metallic click. Not from Darren, not from Karen. Behind Torin's head, inches from his neck, Rennick Voss stood with both arms extended, his hands locked around a compact restraint deployment device, the kind used in rare emergencies, the kind that most crew members never needed outside a training module. And yet, here it was, in shaking hands, disengaged and armed. Torin froze mid-motion. His legs stiffened. His arms hung awkwardly as his body caught itself before collision. His eyes, wild and unfocused just moments before, widened with a different kind of fear. It was confusion first, then disbelief, then something closer to recognition. The cabin held its breath. Gasps broke out. not from the threat of violence but from the sheer absurdity of who had stopped it. Rennick Voss, the soft-voiced, nervous attendant who hadn't spoken louder than a cabin announcement all flight. His jaw was tight, sweat glinting at his temple, but the device in his hand didn't waver. Not much. "Step back," Rennick said. His voice cracked, but not enough to lose command. Torin did not move, or speak. His mouth parted as if trying to summon a retort, but none came. Darren, still crouched with Laron pressed tightly against his chest, rose slowly, keeping his son shielded in his arms. He didn't speak either. He knew this moment could unravel in a blink. Karen moved with purpose, arms out to redirect passengers away from the central aisle. "Let's give them space," he murmured to a nearby traveler. "Move to your seats." The urgency in his voice worked. People obeyed. Whispers buzzed like static, but no one else dared move close. Rennick's hands trembled slightly, but his grip held. What he hadn't realized, and what Darren now did, was that the click hadn't been the device firing. It was the safety being released, which meant one wrong move, one startled twitch, and Rennick might trigger the restraint accidentally. The device's launch force was enough to disable someone in close quarters. Torin didn't know that, but Darren did, and Karen did, and both of them exchanged a brief glance that said the same thing. This is a tighter rope than anyone realizes. Torin's shoulders dropped slightly. His hands lifted slowly, not in surrender, but in that erratic confusion of someone who doesn't know which direction to break in. His eyes flicked from the restraint behind him to Darren, who now stood between him and the bassinet. "I wasn't going to hurt him," Torin muttered. His voice was low, strained. "I didn't mean—" His sentence fractured midway, overtaken by a sudden tremor in his limbs. He shook his head violently as if trying to shake off a memory. "Voices," he hissed. "The song. It keeps playing." The whisper chilled Darren. That wasn't rage anymore. It was fracture, guilt, hallucination, trauma wearing the skin of violence. "Torin," Darren said carefully, stepping forward half a foot. He cradled Laron tighter with one arm, the other raised gently at his side. "I don't know what you're remembering, but you're not there. You're here, with us, on a flight. You need to stay calm." Torin blinked at him. Recognition flickered and vanished. "Don't tell me to calm down," he snapped suddenly, his volume rising just enough to trigger flinches around the cabin. Rennick stiffened behind him, fingers dangerously close to the deployment trigger. Darren steadied his voice. "We're not your enemy. No one here wants to hurt you." Torin's chest rose and fell in short, erratic breaths. "He used to say that too," he muttered. The captain's voice crackled through the overhead system. "All passengers, remain seated. Our crew is handling a security emergency. Stay calm and await further instructions." The announcement reset the moment, brought the silence be. Darren felt a sudden vibration at his waist. His eyes dipped briefly. The beacon. The emergency device clipped just beneath his jacket had received a signal. 3 soft pulses. He recognized the pattern. External security channel connected. That meant his company's Traveler Risk Division had picked up the irregularity from his activation earlier. They weren't coming on board, but they were watching, monitoring, ready to assist remotely. A strange calm filled Darren. He wasn't alone, but no one else knew. Not the passengers, not Torin, not Rennick, and Torin wasn't done. He swayed suddenly as if exhaustion had drained him, but then his hand dropped into his coat again. Darren's eyes snapped downward, tracking the motion. Karen stepped forward. Rennick's finger twitched. "Stop," Darren said quickly, hand raised. "Don't fire, just wait." Torin's fingers dug into his jacket pocket, fumbling with something. For a flash of a second, Darren imagined another weapon, another blade. The breath caught in his throat, but the object never emerged. Torin froze. His eyes welled with a sudden, unexpected emotion. Shame, maybe. or disbelief. Then, in a voice so quiet the front half of the cabin almost missed it, he said, "I didn't mean to hit him. I thought he was someone else." I thought he was someone else. The words fell from Torrin's mouth like broken glass. He had backed himself against the oval airplane window, his breath fogging the cold pane, shoulders rising and falling in jittery rhythm. Silence rippled through the row. The passengers nearby froze in place, unsure whether they had heard him right. Darren, his jaw aching from the earlier blow, remained crouched between the seats, shielding Laurent with both arms, heart pounding in quiet fury. His bruised cheek burned, but his focus never left the threat in front of him. Karen Vale, still stationed between them, narrowed his eyes. "Who did you think he was?" he asked calmly, though tension coiled in his voice like wire pulled tight. Torrin didn't answer immediately. His lips trembled. His eyes, no longer wild but disturbingly vacant, scanned Darren's face again as if trying to read through time itself. "He looked just like him," Torrin murmured almost inaudibly. "Same voice, that song." Darren flinched slightly at the word. Laurent whimpered in his arms. The lullaby. That was the key again. The melody he had composed with his late wife, a thread of peace for his son, now twisted into a trigger that had nearly turned deadly. Rennick Voss, still standing several feet away and holding the restraint device in shaky hands, took a cautious step forward. His arms were stiff from keeping the device aimed so long. Sweat clung to his brow, dripping past the collar of his shirt. "Torrin," he said softly, "please sit down. We're landing soon. Let us help you." Over the intercom, the captain's voice returned, stern but composed. "Cabin crew, initiate emergency landing protocol. We are diverting to Bellaran Airfield, 40 minutes out. All passengers, please remain seated and calm." Darren registered the message quickly. 40 minutes. That was too long. Too much could still go wrong. He slowly shifted Laurent into the bassinet beside him, careful to keep his body angled between the child and Torrin. The baby's harness clicked softly as he secured it. Darren's fingers brushed over the seat's underside, locating the emergency alert clipped to his belt. He tapped it twice. The vibration came seconds later. 3 pulses. A green flash. Ground contact had been made. Somewhere, someone from his firm's Traveler Risk division was watching this unfold in real time. That knowledge didn't stop the pounding in his chest, but it gave him clarity. Karen leaned closer and whispered, "We need to brace for another outburst. He's not settled." Darren gave a small nod. He could see it too, Torrin's rocking motion, the restless twitch in his fingers, the way his jaw flexed like a spring coiled too tight. Then came another shift, an external one. A man 2 rows back stood halfway and leaned into the aisle, gesturing subtly to Rennick. "I think I know that guy," the passenger whispered. "He was kicked off a flight 2 months ago, yelled at a father holding a toddler. Same look in his eyes. It was bad." Rennick's heart sank. He pulled out his crew tablet, hands shaking. The Wi-Fi was stable enough. He ran a name scan. Torrin Hald. The system took a moment longer than expected to load, but then the screen lit up. Flagged. 2 prior alerts, both involving erratic verbal outbursts toward men carrying children. One report even mentioned a repeated phrase, "It's the same voice." Yet, due to a server maintenance delay, the data hadn't synced with the flight's live manifest. Rennick stared at the words. Behavioral escalation. Incomplete. Clearance approved by default. His gut twisted. This flight should have been blocked to him. Rennick's voice cracked as he leaned toward Darren. He wasn't supposed to be on board. System error. The sync failed. Darren nodded grimly. "We're all paying for that sync." Meanwhile, the other passengers had grown restless. Some were whispering nervously. Others held their phones low, still recording. The sharp scent of tension hung in the air. A child across the aisle began crying quietly. The plane wasn't violent anymore, but it was frightened. Then Torin turned. Not toward Darren this time, but toward Karen. His eyes sharpened with sudden focus. His voice dropped into something deeper, colder. "He sang that song, too," Torin said, lips tightening, "right before the fire." The words landed like a blade across the silence. Karen blinked. "What fire?" But Torin didn't answer. He was somewhere else now, somewhere far behind the present, lost in a memory no one else could see. His fists clenched again. He swayed, not from turbulence but from something rising within him. Darren's heart beat faster, not in fear, but in calculation. That statement, "He sang that song too," was more than rambling. It was a thread, the lullaby. It had to be tied to a memory, something tragic, something Torin couldn't let go. But the connection felt too pointed, too obsessive to be random. A fire, a song, a face mistaken for Darren's. He glanced at Laurent again, then at Karen, then at the rest of the passengers, all now suspended in collective uncertainty. The melody was never just a lullaby to Torin, and in that moment, Darren realized, they weren't dealing with a violent man anymore. They were trapped in the unraveling grief of someone who believed this flight had resurrected a ghost. And the ghost wore his face. Ending line, unchanged. Torin suddenly turns to Karen and says in a chilling tone, "He sang that song too, right before the fire." Torin's voice, cracked and low, cuts through the tense silence like a blade. "If you didn't save him, I'll make sure you never sing again." Darren stiffens, clutching Laron tighter. The baby whimpers, sensing his father's unease. Karen steps in closer, his eyes flicking from Darren to Torin, trying to assess whether this is a threat or a breakdown, or both. The passengers nearby are frozen, caught between their own fear and the need to understand what they're witnessing. But Torin isn't done. His eyes glaze over, locked somewhere beyond the present. He murmurs, "Before the fire," and then louder, that song. It was playing. The words don't make sense at first, but Darren's expression shifts as a terrible possibility begins to take root in his mind. He slowly sits back, balancing Laron on his lap, his thoughts racing. That lullaby. He had written it with his wife. It was private, intimate, part of their life with Laron before she passed. He never released it publicly, but there was one exception. Years ago, Darren had helped organize a memorial concert for engineering alumni, a tribute to his wife, who had also worked at the university. The song had been used in a video. Only a few people had even seen it. Karen notices the change in Darren's face and leans closer. "Did that song ever go public?" he asks in a hushed voice. Darren nods once, slowly. "One video. A memorial my firm supported. I didn't think anyone would—" He trails off, dread forming like ice in his chest. The thought that someone heard that melody, absorbed it into a fractured memory, and twisted it into a symbol of rage and loss. It chills him more than Torin's earlier outburst. And then Torin speaks again, louder now, clearer. There was smoke, a baby, a man holding him, standing in the window, and that song was playing. He looked right at me, then turned away. Every word feels like a weight dropping onto the cabin. Passengers exchange glances, some filming again, others whispering. Karen's face tightens. Darren listens, knowing none of it is familiar, yet feeling the truth in the pain behind the voice. Torin reaches into his coat pocket. The cabin tenses. Karen's hand drifts near his waist, unsure whether Torin is about to pull out a weapon. Rennick, standing several rows back, lifts the restraint device instinctively. But what Torin draws out isn't a blade. It's a photo. Cracked, folded at the edges, the color faded into sepia. Smoke damage darkens the corners. He tosses it toward Darren with a snap of his wrist. The picture lands on the floor beside Darren's foot. "That was you," Torin shouts, pointing. "That's the same face." The cabin gasps. Laron startles. Karen kneels and picks up the photo. Darren leans in, staring at it. The image is a blurry shot of a man silhouetted against flames, holding a small child in his arms. The man's face is obscured, barely visible through the distortion, but Darren sees instantly that it's not him. The nose is too narrow. The build is wrong. Even the posture is different. Yet to Torin, in his grief-stricken, guilt-soaked state, it's undeniable. Darren lifts the photo and looks Torin directly in the eyes. His voice is low but firm. "That's not me," he says. "I wasn't there. I'm sorry for your loss, but you're chasing a ghost." Torin's breath catches. The line hangs in the air like a final note. His lips part slightly, but no words come out. His whole body sways, as if the foundation of his belief has cracked beneath him. Rennick steps closer, the restraint device still in his hands, but he doesn't need to use it. Torin's arms drop to his sides, his legs fold, and he sinks into the seat nearest the window, trembling. Passengers begin murmuring, unsure if the danger has passed or merely paused. Karen, still clutching the photo, hands it quietly to Darren. "He really believed it," he whispers. Darren nods. He still does, but something just broke inside him. Rennick exhales deeply, lowering the device. His forehead glistens with sweat, but his grip remains steady. Torin leans against the wall of the cabin, muttering again, his voice a mixture of confusion and grief. He repeats the phrase like a chant. "It was him. It was him. The song. The fire." Karen watches him for several long seconds, then turns to Darren and speaks barely above a whisper, a chill in his voice. "He's not done. He's just broken enough to try something worse." Torin lunged. It wasn't toward Darren, not at first. His sudden motion ripped through the tension like a jagged blade, catching everyone off guard. From his seat, he bolted across the narrow aisle, one hand stretched toward the intercom mounted on the bulkhead wall. "If you didn't save him," he growled, his voice clear and alarmingly focused, "I'll make sure you never sing again." His fingers slammed against the panel. The intercom crackled to life before anyone could intercept him. Passengers flinched, turning toward the voice they now recognized as the man who had attacked a father cradling his baby. "You all think he's a hero," Torin announced, his voice ringing through every speaker in the aircraft, cold and trembling. "But he left my nephew to burn. I remember the song. It's a curse." Panic flared in the cabin. Gasps echoed through the fuselage. Some passengers ducked instinctively. Others looked around for help. In row 7, a man clutched his chest. Near the emergency exit, someone tried to calm a weeping toddler. The plane itself seemed to respond. The lighting dimmed. The engines shifted tone as the autopilot recalibrated for descent. And above all, the intercom clicked off abruptly as the cockpit cut power to cabin-wide announcements. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Darren's eyes were locked on Torin's every move. He didn't freeze. He didn't hesitate. As Torin turned from the intercom and charged, Darren reached toward his belt pouch. His fingers found the foldable shielding card issued by his company's Traveler Risk Division, a rectangular slab of layered polymer and carbon thread designed to absorb impact in emergencies. With a practiced flick, he snapped it open and brought it to his chest just in time. Torin's punch landed hard against the shield. The sound echoed like a muffled drumbeat, jarring but contained. Darren didn't retreat. He stepped forward into the momentum, catching Torin's elbow with his free arm and spinning him off-center, guiding the man's aggression toward the aisle. The move was deliberate. Not retaliation, but redirection. The kind of motion that came from years of restraint-based training. Torin staggered, lost balance for a heartbeat, but his fury didn't fade. With a grunt, he reached into his coat pocket. Darren's muscles tensed. The glint of metal confirmed it. The folding knife. A rush of movement followed. Torin tried to snap the blade into place, but the mechanism jammed. The fall earlier had bent the joint. He shook it, yanked it. Nothing. Frustration twisted his face as he raised the jammed knife like a blunt object. Darren reacted instantly. With his shielding card still raised, he sidestepped and struck the blade from Torin's hand. It skidded beneath the seats, out of reach. Karen Vale, who had shadowed the conflict with unblinking focus, stepped in from behind. His arms locked around Torin's shoulders, bracing him in a tight hold. "Don't move," Karen ordered, his voice low and steady. Torin thrashed. For a moment it looked like he might break free. That's when Rennick Voss appeared behind them, restraint bands in hand. His expression was taut with fear, but his movements were surprisingly sure. "Hold him just a second more," Rennick said quickly. He reached forward, slipped one band around Torin's left wrist, then the right, pulling them taut. The soft hiss of locking mechanisms filled the silence. Torin struggled once, twice, then slumped. The cabin was dead silent save for a baby's cry. Lairon, still buckled in the bassinet beside Darren's seat, was sobbing now, high-pitched and frightened. Darren turned immediately, kneeling beside the cradle, checking his son's face, brushing a palm over his soft cheek. Lairon's cries slowed at his father's touch. His tiny fingers reached for Darren's thumb, as they always did. The room around them blurred for a moment. It was only them, father and son, breathing through a nightmare together. But then, the words. Torin, seated and restrained at the rear of the cabin, looked straight at Darren. His voice was quieter now, but every syllable rang with pain. "It's still your fault," he whispered, "even if you weren't him." The passenger smirked, confident his strike would go unchallenged, unaware that every movement, every witness, and every second had already triggered the father's calculated response. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets unstoppable authority, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The wheels hit the tarmac with a dull thud, and the cabin jolts slightly. The descent was smooth, but no one breathes easily. Not yet. The captain's voice, steady but firm, announces, "Valaris. Flight 319 has landed at Belleran Airfield. We ask all passengers to remain seated." But even before the words end, all eyes have shifted toward the rear cabin, where Torin Hald sits, restrained, breathing through his nose in slow, uneven bursts. His wrists are bound with reinforced mesh cuffs, his ankles locked to the floor rail. Karen Vale stands beside him, arms crossed, alert. He doesn't speak, doesn't blink much, he just watches. The man's earlier calm has now hardened into quiet readiness, shaped by what they'd all just witnessed, a man unraveling midair. At the front of the aircraft, Rennick Voss leans close to the cockpit door, whispering a report to the captain. His hands tremble slightly, adrenaline still coursing through him. "He's contained. No further resistance," he says quietly. "Malvik and the child are safe." Darren sits a few rows ahead of Torin, Lairon pressed against his chest. The child's cries had long faded, replaced by a tense, eerie silence that settled over the passengers like frost. Lairon's small fist clutches Darren's shirt, the fabric slightly damp where the baby's tears had fallen. Darren stares forward, not at anything, just into space. His body aches. His jaw throbs. But his mind turns in sharper directions. He replays it, the punch, the knife, the screaming voice over the intercom, and that final chilling sentence. "It's still your fault, even if you weren't him." The words echo in his head like a code left unsolved. And yet Darren knows. There was no solving Torin, not in the way systems or science solved problems. This man had been wounded by something older than this flight, and tonight that wound ruptured. "I should have seen it sooner," Darren murmurs. Karen, who's stepped closer, hears him. "Don't do that," he replies quietly. "You were focused on your son. That's what mattered." Darren turns, meets his eyes. The system flagged him before. Someone missed it. A sync error. What if it wasn't? Karen nods grimly. "There was a delay. I checked the log. The warning was issued 2 weeks ago. Mid-level risk due to behavioral instability. Never reached active crew because the software update failed mid-cycle. That's all it took. One missing sync, Darren mutters, his voice bitter. One broken man. One near tragedy. The cabin doors open without fanfare. No dramatic entrance, just the soft hydraulic hiss and a click. But what follows is different from standard protocol. Two men in plain black jackets step aboard. No badges, no names, just silent authority. One gives a subtle nod to Rennick, who steps aside. They move with precision, approaching Torrin without a word. He doesn't resist. His head is bowed now. His lips move faintly, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in memory. He's not violent anymore. He's hollowed. Passengers pull out phones again. Some film discreetly. Others just watch, eyes wide, still processing the quiet war that had unfolded in row 11. A few begin to clap, hesitantly. Then others join. The sound builds, not loud, but present. A strange gesture. Applause not for victory, but perhaps for survival. Darren doesn't react. He simply rises, holding LaRon close as he steps into the aisle. Every muscle in his back is stiff. Karen walks with him, staying one step behind, watchful. At the threshold of the aircraft, Karen taps his arm and hands him the photo. The same scorched image that Torrin had thrown at him mid-flight. Darren stares at it. The shape of a man, a child, flames curling around the frame of a window. But he's sure of it now. That man wasn't him. Never was. Still, he tucks the photo into his jacket pocket. Outside the gate, the air is colder than expected. The lights of the tarmac stretch in rows, distant and sterile. Waiting for them is a man in a gray coat, standing beside a black vehicle with the words Traveler Risk Division, stenciled faintly near the hood. Darren Malvik? The man asks as they approach. His voice is clear, practiced. Yes, Darren replies, shifting LaRon slightly on his shoulder. I'm Aaron Malice. I monitored your beacon alert. He holds up a sleek device identical to the one clipped discreetly on Darren's belt. Your signal synced through our backup mesh. We traced the interference spike mid-air and pushed it to priority review. Darren raises an eyebrow. So, you saw it? Everything post-alert. Aaron nods. Your use of the shielding card. The engagement arc, the restraint attempt. We logged it for post-action analysis. Karen steps forward. What happens now? Aaron answers, Internal review, protocol revisions. The oversight in the sync cycle will be patched across all corporate lanes. Darren's signal triggered a Tier 2 safety threshold. That tier is being raised system-wide. Darren exhales slowly. It's not about punishment, but if this system exists to protect people like my son, it needs to actually work. And now it will, Aaron promises. Darren doesn't respond. He simply tightens his grip on LaRon and begins walking toward the terminal, moving it past the flash of cameras stationed behind glass, past the whispers and speculation beginning to bloom in the shadows of the airport's perimeter. Inside, the crew begins its debrief. Rennick's hands still tremble as he recounts each phase of the incident. Karen stays behind briefly to support the process, then excuses himself, stepping into the hallway to catch up. He finds Darren sitting on a bench just outside the terminal's side entrance, LaRon asleep on his chest, the child's breath light and steady. Karen doesn't speak right away. He simply sits beside him. After a moment, he says quietly, You didn't just protect your son. You broke someone's ghost. The video spreads like wildfire. Within hours of landing, footage from a passenger's phone, shaky, breathless, raw, hits every major platform. The scene is brief but unforgettable. A baby's cry, a sudden punch, the audible click of a restraint device, and a father rising from his seat with terrifying calm. Headlines erupt with simplified versions of the truth. Father defends infant mid-flight from violent passenger. Baby attacked on plane. Passenger stopped cold. But the internet sees only the surface. What they don't see is the deeper fracture beneath. The grief, the delusion, the song. Darren watches the story spread from the privacy of his home. He doesn't comment. He doesn't post. He declines every interview, every request from media outlets hungry for a quote or a face to attach to the story. Instead, he turns his attention inward, to his son, to his bruised cheekbone, and to the flaw in the system that allowed this to happen. Across the city, in a secured psychiatric facility, Torrin Hald sits under evaluation. A panel of doctors studies him, listens to his mutterings, and begins assembling the broken puzzle of his mind. Diagnosed with trauma-induced delusional disorder, Torrin's medical records paint a picture of a man living in a shadow world, where memories, guilt, and unresolved pain collided in a dangerous hallucination. His nephew had died in a fire. That much was true. And the man in the charred photograph, real, but cleared of any wrongdoing long ago. The tragedy wasn't Darren's fault, it never was. But in Torrin's mind, the lullaby had turned into a curse, and Darren's face had become the canvas for his regret. Volaris Airlines moves fast. Within 72 hours, they issue a carefully worded public apology. A spokesperson offers compensation to Darren and his family, acknowledges a system error that failed to flag Torrin, and promises an internal audit of their behavioral alert protocols. But when the offer comes through, 6 figures and lifetime travel credit, Darren refuses. "I don't want money," he tells the airline's liaison over the phone, his tone calm but final. "I want the funds diverted to crew training, trauma recognition, de-escalation." There's a pause on the other end. Then quiet agreement. Rennick Voss receives a message the same day. He's being honored, along with Karen Vale, in a closed ceremony for decisive action during a volatile situation. Rennick nearly declines. He doesn't feel like a hero. But when he sees Darren quietly attending the small event, standing in the back holding LaRon, he steps forward and accepts the medal. Afterward, he pulls Darren aside. "I'd never used the restraint device before," Rennick admits, eyes searching the floor. "In training, I fumbled it twice. But when you didn't panic, I don't know, I just acted." "You did more than act," Darren replies. "You gave my son time. That's all I needed." The weight of it all doesn't fade quickly. Even as the public shifts its attention to the next headline, the emotional debris remains. In the evenings, Darren walks through the park with LaRon cradled in one arm. The sun dips low, painting amber streaks through the trees. On one such walk, he begins to hum the lullaby again. Slowly, cautiously. There's a flicker of hesitation, a memory, a bruise. But then, from the safety of his arms, LaRon giggles, a small bubbling sound that melts the last of Darren's doubt. He smiles. The lullaby didn't cause the violence. It never did. That song, written with love, sung for peace, was stolen for a moment by someone else's pain. But now, in this quiet place, Darren reclaims it. He looks down at his son, who grips his finger and coos softly beneath the warm sky. This time, no one's going to silence our song. The fallout began before the plane even cooled on the tarmac. In the immediate days following the emergency landing at Belleran Airfield, the incident aboard Volaris Flight 319 spread like a wildfire through the digital sky. The viral clip, blurred, shaky, but unmistakably powerful, showed a man protecting a child from a violent passenger. A punch, a cry, a restraint click, and a father who didn't flinch. But while the internet turned the moment into content, regulators, airline executives, and aviation safety boards began dissecting the event with surgical urgency. The first leak arrived 72 hours after the landing, an internal memo from Volaris Airlines showing that Torrin Hald had been flagged before. Twice. Noted for agitated behavior and verbal outbursts toward passengers with children, the alerts had each been marked for follow-up but ultimately dismissed under the same vague clause, insufficient behavioral escalation. Now, that phrase read like a silent accomplice. News outlets seized the revelation. Pundits questioned how someone with multiple prior incidents had boarded again without added screening. The airline scrambled. Press releases were issued, statements revised. Their tone shifted from defensiveness to apology, but it was too late. Online, the tone had already been set, negligence dressed as oversight. Meanwhile, Darren Malvik remained silent. He declined all media requests, interviews, podcasts, even a private book deal. Not because he lacked something to say, but because the story had never been about him. He returned to work, quietly and deliberately, resuming his role as a senior systems engineer at Elvora Dynamics. But beneath the stillness, he was building something else. Inside a dimly lit corner of his home office, Darren reviewed early drafts of a new proposal, legislation, crafted not by lobbyists but by analysts, engineers, and risk operatives like himself. It was called the Flight Integrity and Passenger Safety Act. Its purpose, a centralized, real-time behavioral flagging system. No more isolated alerts buried in airline silos, no more dismissed reports because one airline system hadn't synced with another. Every passenger history, linked and visible, quietly, securely, and without loopholes. He had one condition. "My name doesn't go on it," Darren said over a secure call with Karen Vale, who now served as liaison between Elvora's internal safety team and government counsel. "But the impact," Karen began. "It's about protecting my son," Darren interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Not becoming a symbol." Outside, the wind rustled through a line of trees beyond the glass. Inside, Darren stared at the object that sat on his desk every night since the flight. The photo. It was still warped from smoke damage. The image itself, barely distinguishable, showed a man at a window, a child in his arms, flames in the backdrop. Torin had thrown it at him mid-flight, screaming about betrayal and memory. Even now, holding it made Darren's chest tighten. He didn't keep it out of sympathy. He kept it as a reminder. Broken systems don't just miss signs. They deepen delusions. They warp the broken further. The next twist arrived quietly. Elvora's security division reached out 2 days later with an unexpected discovery. The man in the photo, the one Torin had mistaken Darren for, was alive, retired, living under a new name in the outskirts of Valtrin Hollow. The photo was real. The fire had happened, but so had the man's innocence. Investigated, cleared, still haunted. Darren made a decision. No interviews, no confrontation, no second trauma. Instead, he contacted a legal associate and arranged to have the man's digital identity cleared from public-facing archives. Quietly, thoroughly. If the viral storm ever found its way toward that man, it would find only silence. That night, unable to sleep, Darren reached for his tablet. He opened the passenger's recording, the one taken from across the aisle. The video began with shaky audio, then cut to the moment Torin rose. The punch, the fall, the click behind Torin's head, the cries, the restraint. And there, in the center of it all, was himself. No fear in his eyes, no rage, only something steady. Resolve. He paused the video, rewound, played it again, slower, watched the exact moment he stood, not as a victim, not as a fighter, but as a shield. One hand raised, one arm around his son. No noise, no shaking, only the quiet determination of a father making a decision before anyone else understood the stakes. For the first time, Darren realized something he hadn't admitted, even to himself. He hadn't just been protecting Laron from Torin. He was protecting Laron from the world his silence might have allowed. Rennick Voss couldn't shake the sound of the restraint device's safety click. It echoed in his memory with perfect clarity, sharper than the passenger's shout, sharper even than the baby's cry. It had been instinct, not training, that made him raise the compact device behind Torin's head. And yet, something in that split-second decision had altered the direction of an entire flight, of a life, possibly of many. Less than a week later, in a quiet corner office at the headquarters of Arendelle Technologies, Darren Malvik signed the final approval forms for a new project launch. The paperwork was ordinary in format: internal memos, training schedules, budget breakdowns. But the name at the top wasn't. Bold font, centered and silent in its weight, Project Laron. No announcement was made to the public. There were no press releases or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Instead, an internal email circulated within the firm's Traveler Risk Division, outlining the creation of a civilian training arm focused on nonviolent de-escalation, situational awareness, and protective behavior under duress. Skills Darren had drawn from mid-flight, not because he was trained to be a hero, but because he refused to become a casualty. The project's quiet motto: "Every child deserves a world where lullabies are safe." The very next day, an unexpected application landed on Darren's desk. Rennick Voss. The same crew member who once feared confrontation so deeply he'd avoid eye contact during turbulence now requested a formal transfer into the civilian unit. In his brief but handwritten cover note, Rennick wrote only one line: "That moment changed what I thought I was capable of." Darren stared at the words. There was no bravado, no plea for recognition, just a man owning the most terrifying second of his life and choosing to grow from it. Darren didn't respond. He simply signed the approval and forwarded it to Human Resources. In the training bay 2 weeks later, Rennick stood among a small group of recruits, most of them ex-teachers, junior attendants, or airport staff, listening to a soft-spoken instructor explain how fear narrows vision and reaction time. Rennick said little, but every time the instructor mentioned the importance of calm under pressure, his hands flexed unconsciously. He remembered the device, the trembling, the click. Miles away. Inside the solitary ward of the Belleran Psychiatric Institute, Torrenhald sat by the window. His eyes no longer burned with the wild rage from that night. Instead, they held something different: confusion, weariness, and a strange, searching stillness. Doctors observed his behavior around the clock, noting small repetitions. He didn't shout anymore. He didn't lash out. Instead, he hummed. Not the full lullaby. Just fragments. Fragments that resembled the tune Darren had sung, but gentler now, softer, and always following the same words. It wasn't him. It wasn't him. His psychiatrist, Dr. Emer Varnell, noted in the log, "The patient has disassociated from the moment of violence. He no longer believes the man on the plane was the person from the fire. Delusion collapsing. Guilt remains." There were no press conferences, no trials, no televised drama. The court quietly ruled Torren unfit for criminal proceedings due to long-standing, undiagnosed trauma-induced delusional disorder. The decision to forego charges shocked some, but Darren made his position known through an intermediary. Justice is stopping him from doing it again, not locking away a broken man. Karen Vale sat in a dim study, surrounded by old notebooks and unused pens, fingers hovering over his laptop keyboard. For weeks he had replayed the incident in his mind: Torren's fists, Darren's quiet resistance, the baby's cries, the photo with the burning window. He didn't want the story to vanish beneath headlines and legal memos. So he began writing. The article wasn't for a blog, not for publication. It was private, for those who had been on that flight, for those who might someday need to remember. He changed the names, removed the airline, made every detail anonymous but left the soul untouched. He titled it, "The Man Who Kept Singing." He described the hum of the engines, the lullaby, the passenger whose trauma took shape in the form of a stranger, and the father who did not flinch. In the final lines, Karen paused. He thought of Darren, quiet, bruised, holding his child with both arms even after being struck. He remembered the stillness, the way the song had continued after the violence. He wrote, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep singing while someone plots to silence you." The boarding chime echoed softly through the terminal, its familiar notes fading into the quiet hum of twilight. Darren Malvik looked up from the bench where Laron rested against his chest, fingers curled into the fabric of his father's jacket. The gentle tone caught him off guard, not because it was loud or jarring, but because of how closely it mirrored the melody he thought he'd buried. He remained still, listening. It wasn't identical. Not quite. Just a few notes, perhaps accidental. But it was enough to still his breath. Outside the broad terminal windows, the sun melted into the distant horizon, casting a golden wash across the polished floor. People moved around them. Pilots, attendants, a janitor mopping a tiled aisle, but Darren and Laron remained in a bubble of stillness. A few rows away, Jalen Maris sat beside his son, a boy maybe 5 years old with a nervous grip on his seatbelt strap and twitching feet. Jalen had glanced over earlier when Laron cried during boarding. Now he approached slowly, hands in his coat pockets, the kind of cautious steps only fathers of anxious children learn. "Excuse me," Jalen said, his voice low, respectful. "I couldn't help noticing earlier. The song you were humming. My son calms down to music, too, but none of mine work." Darren looked up, startled but not annoyed. Laron stirred in his arms and blinked sleepily. "That song," Jalen continued, hesitating. "Would you mind sharing it? I know it's personal." Darren's jaw tensed slightly. For a long second, he didn't answer. That lullaby wasn't just a song. It had been a trigger for pain, violence, and misunderstanding. But it was also a bond between him and his wife, and between him and his son. To share it now would be to choose to reclaim it, not as a memory of fear, but as something pure again. He slowly reached into his coat, pulled out his phone, and opened the original audio file. "No words," Darren said softly, pressing play. "Just this." The melody flowed gently from the speaker, delicate as wind through pine trees. Jalen's son stopped fidgeting. His small shoulders relaxed. He leaned into his father's side, eyes half closed. For a few minutes, nothing else mattered. They sat like that. Two fathers, two sons, and a song once associated with loss now becoming something else entirely. Darren didn't offer explanations. He didn't talk about Torin Hald, or restraint devices, or synced flagging protocols. This moment wasn't about the past. It was about what the lullaby was always supposed to mean. Peace, safety, presence. When the song ended, Jalen gave a slow nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. I think I needed to hear that as much as he did." Darren just nodded once. No reply felt necessary. The public may have moved on from Valaris Flight 319. Headlines had faded. Comment threads dried up. But behind the scenes, everything had changed. 3 major airlines responding to public pressure and internal audits had adopted the real-time behavioral sync protocol. Smaller carriers followed suit. Now, flagged passengers, like Torin had once been, could not slip through the cracks due to server errors or outdated logs. Red flags lit up in real time across systems. Ground crews received silent alerts. Cabin staff, newly trained under the first wave of the reform initiative, responded to rising tension not with fear, but with informed de-escalation. Videos surfaced showing these changes in action. A flight attendant gently talking down a nervous man in row 4. A captain coordinating silently with a ground team while a child cried 3 rows behind. None of these clips went viral. None became trending hashtags, but they worked, because one father had refused to let silence take the place of response. Darren had declined interviews, turned down speaking offers, refused book deals. He was no symbol. He was a father. That had always been enough. Now he traveled with Laron to quieter places, a coastal park where the tide whispered at dawn, a lake his wife once loved, where trees bent over the water like guardians, a forest trail where Laron giggled at squirrels and kicked leaves. None of it was dramatic, but it was healing. And sometimes in the terminal, someone would recognize him, not from a news clip, but from a ripple of the melody. They would nod, silently. Darren would nod back. As the sun dipped lower, he scooped Laron into his arms, the boy already half asleep. he adjusted the strap on his duffel, tightened his grip, and began walking toward their gate. The intercom, CC, this time there was no mistaking it. 3 notes, the same 3 that began the lullaby. A pause. Then the rest of the boarding music continued, as if unaware of what had just stirred. Darren stopped mid-step, looked up at the ceiling speaker, and whispered under his breath, not to the terminal, not to the airline, but to the part of him that once feared the melody would never be safe again. Even here, it still finds its way. The first line was already echoing in the quiet hall when Darren Malvik stepped through the side entrance, unnoticed. He carried his son, Leron, against his chest, one hand gently cradling the toddler's back, the other tucked into his coat pocket. The room was warm, wood-paneled, and softly lit. Nothing like the cabin of Volaris Flight 319, but Darren's breath still caught in his throat as if bracing for turbulence. A man on stage, tall and pale with silver hair, spoke with conviction to the modest crowd. We honor not the names we remember, but the silence they preserved so others could remain whole. No applause followed, only a collective stillness, reverence. The ceremony had no press coverage, no banners, no formal registry. It was invitation only, a gathering of people who had endured something they didn't speak of in public. Project Leron was completing its first full year. Darren had kept his distance during its development, opting to guide the initiative through encrypted channels and private protocols, ensuring no one ever placed his name at the center. Now, he stood at the edge of the room, blending into the crowd, eyes scanning over the 300 graduates seated in crisp formation. Pilots, flight attendants, counselors. A handful of quiet fathers who wore the same distant look Darren had once carried. A long curtain parted slowly on stage. Behind it hung a single plaque, sleek, black, and glinting under soft lights. No names etched into its face. Just one quote in silver letters. Not all shields are visible. Some are lullabies. Some are fathers. A ripple moved through the audience, but still no clapping. Only silence, earned and heavy. Darren stood still, his fingers gently tapping a quiet rhythm on Leron's back. The child murmured, but did not wake. Darren didn't wait for the closing speech. As applause finally swelled behind him, he was already moving toward the exit, stepping into the cool evening air outside the building. Snow had begun to fall, light flurries that danced in the parking lot lights. The wind picked up slightly, and Darren adjusted Leron's blanket, shielding him from the breeze. He didn't notice Karen Vale until the man caught up to him, footsteps crunching the gravel lightly. "You're just going to vanish again?" Karen asked, half smiling, half serious. His coat was open, his badge from the ceremony still visible around his neck. Darren shrugged, his eyes still scanning the horizon. "I was never meant to be in there." Karen handed him a small envelope. Heavy parchment, no label. "This came for you. No sender. Just something that found its way." Darren opened it slowly, his fingers feeling the coarse edge of the card inside. One line, handwritten in dark ink. "For the one who sang through the storm." No signature, just the words, quiet and enough. Darren exhaled softly, and for the first time in weeks, his shoulders dropped. "I don't need to know who," he murmured. Karen nodded. They knew it too. Back home, the apartment was quiet. Leron had fallen asleep again during the ride. Darren carried him through the doorway, past the entry hall, into the small nursery filled with muted colors and stars glued to the ceiling. He laid him down gently, pulling the blanket to his chin and brushing a hand across the boy's cheek. The silence in the room was comforting, not heavy like the plane, not tense like the hall, just quiet. Darren sat beside the crib, phone in hand. He hesitated, thumb hovering over a folder labeled Memory. It had only one file inside. He tapped it. A soft melody spilled out, low, slow, warm. The lullaby, the original recording. His wife's voice accompanied it in faint harmony. from a time when they believed the world would never try to shatter them. Darren looked down at Laurent, whose fingers twitched once, then relaxed. He leaned forward. His voice was a whisper. His words not meant for the world, or for the flight, or for the man who tried to take everything away. They were for the boy who still breathed beside him. No matter who tries to silence us, we will always finish the song. Disclaimer. The story you just watched is fictional. It explores arrogance, abuse of authority, and the unexpected consequences of underestimating someone. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.